see. And so is it that experience of happiness, so it's that experience of happiness or pleasure that gives us a confidence in what we believe?
Right. Well, yeah, right. Especially with like happiness, but it is hard to distinguish between happiness and pleasure, I think.
Yeah.
If it's happening to you,
Mm-hmm.
I think that is tricky, but I think you can start by ruling out pleasures that you know are not good.
Yeah. So I don't know. See, I'd kind of like for us to pivot. Page 10. You describe Augustine's conversion experience.
Right.
So he hears the verse and he goes to read it. And you write, Augustine, however, does not look at it, the verse, as nothing. Augustine weeps and at that moment realizes that, quote, all the shadows of doubt were dispelled. He knew that this God was the correct one. He knew that this God was real and watching over him just from this one incident. Against reason, he realized with a leap of faith that he had found the truth. And once he made the leap of faith, the answer seemed so clear to him. So you bring together correctness, against reason, and truth in the same thought. And so how do those fit together? How can how can I, without reason, determine something as correct or true?
Right. So I think that in that paragraph, I was really trying to use a lot of Kierkegaard's language. I was trying to strengthen the relationship between Augustine's journey of faith and the journey of faith that Kierkegaard describes. And for Kierkegaard, he says that you have to acknowledge that God is irrational, or that God doesn't make sense. But he also says that you have to accept him and say that he is true, or that he is real. And I think, so that's what when I said he knew that this God was the correct one, that was me kind of saying, like, he's making that second step. And then against reason, and it's against reason because he realizes that God is irrational. I mean, the whole book is him going through and struggling with how the Catholic faith doesn't make sense, and he's trying to find, and he goes through a bunch of other faiths that also don't make sense, and he's really trying to find his way, and he acknowledges that the faith doesn't make sense, or the thing that he's trying to have faith in doesn't make sense, but he still believes in God. So that's why I was saying that is against reason.
And I do like that observation, because you even see in the later books of the Confessions, he goes out of his way to develop faith or God as an inherently confusing, kind of mind-bending thing.
Especially with the time chapter.
Mm-hmm. So it really fits with the way that he seems to approach it.
Yeah.
So you're interpreting that he knew that this God was the correct one as more of he acknowledged or accepted chose.
Yeah. Maybe. Chose. That one's kind of interesting because I didn't explore it in this paper, but I've also always kind of struggled with if we choose what we have faith in, because I don't really know how I feel about it. But so I don't know if I would confidently use that word, but I would definitely say like accepts God. He's just very confident in that he has found the truth or found the correct God.
Can you help me out with another thing?
Yeah, sure.
So this idea that he is submitting to something that he has not rationally proven as true.
Right.
Sounds a little bit to there are hints of a servile move in that. And so I was wondering, could you walk me through what is it that Nietzsche misunderstands about faith? Because I think you could have taken a little bit more from him, and I'm not sure he disagrees with you as much as you think he does.
My whole thing is that Nietzsche seems to have his main belief is like that the Christian faith is evil, and it is an enslavement, kind of like you were saying, how it almost seems like Augustine might be kind of servile, which I remember actually Nietzsche brings that up about Augustine. Yeah, he says, I put it on, it's on page 14 in my paper. Nietzsche talks about types of passion for God and actually claims that Augustine's passion is an oriental ecstatic kind, like that of a slave who has been undeservedly pardoned and elevated. So it was interesting, he's comparing Augustine to a slave there as well. And I don't know, I just feel like his idea of Christianity being slavery, I think that the metaphor kind of falls apart because I think that it's really hard. Because I remember reading that and disagreeing with it, and I think that the problem is, and maybe this is kind of an answer to the question I had earlier, is that, or like the question about Christians choosing faith, because I know I brought that up here, and I think that a big thing for me is when I read that, the first thing that came to my mind is that like Augustine chose his faith, which maybe that kind of answers the question I had earlier. And I think that like one example of Nietzsche or misunderstanding faith in my opinion is that he says that the Christians are slaves, or he says that Christianity enslaves people, and I think it's problematic because slaves don't choose to be enslaved, I think. Or if they do, I think that it is not as big of a deal, because I think it's a lot worse to be forced in, if you choose to go into slavery, which I think would like I'm thinking of the American slavery system where they were born into it, they didn't choose it, and I think that that's not very similar to how Christianity would enslave people. So I think that's one example. And I also think that Nietzsche is just kind of, I mean, I use that quote where he says, to close your ears to even the best counter-argument once the decision has been taken, a sign of strong character. And that just really resonated wrong with me, because I think that it's not strong character to close your ears to counter arguments. I think that actually shows weak character. But
could he have been joking?
Huh?
Could he have been joking?
I don't know, because the context of it is it's just that sentence.
There's no context.
Yeah, it's just a. So I mean, I don't know, because it seems like it's tricky.
What if? I'm really stuck on this happiness thing, I guess. What if someone chose slavery because it made them happy? Isn't that the language we see in the Romans?
I guess I have a problem with that hypothetical because I'm not sure if someone who is enslaved can truly be happy.
What if they were enslaved to the good?
Can you speak more to that? I don't know, like, what are you
Well, I was thinking of in the book of Romans when St. Paul talks about being a slave to Christ. And you're talking about Christians choose their fate. And if Paul says he is a slave to Christ and he chose that, is it because it made him happy? Or
That's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that, so I'm not.
it's very interesting.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Because I've always kind of said that happiness and I think freedom go hand in hand, but then that's interesting, the idea of being enslaved to the good.
Yeah.
that kind of puts the kibosh on that. So I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure how to answer that honestly. Like I guess I would probably say that is good, that could make someone happy, because if you're enslaved to the good, then that would mean that you are most likely always doing that which is good. And maybe someone who's enslaved to the good would be better than someone who's totally free, which is kind of scary.
Yeah.
Also.
Or is that more along the lines of what you were saying before, the love of loving God?
Right.
You're enslaved to it,
Yeah.
but it's your...
That was page
That was-
17.
Yeah, back to page 17, the quote that you all mentioned earlier, as he's constantly talking more and more about how much he loves God, and even more so how much he loves loving God. So you are enslaved to the good, you're enslaved to loving God, or doing the things, that in Paul's case, he was in jail, I think, at the time you were talking about what you're saying. So it's just like, you love being in jail, how does that,
Yeah.
how does that go together? So if you view that slavery, being a slave to, maybe the viewpoint is different when you're viewing it as loving God.
Yeah.
That is it. It is.
Yeah.
It is indeed.
It makes me wonder about freedom. The first sacrifice that is made in the Christian faith, according to Nietzsche, is the sacrifice of freedom.
Right.
But in the way that we described it, or the way that you described it, faith is something that allows for freedom.
Right.
So I'm wondering, do you have a different understanding of freedom than Nietzsche does? Are there different expectations that are going on?
Yeah, I wonder if, I almost wonder if we agree on the means of argument, but have completely different ends. Because I wonder if, now that we've been talking about it, I kind of think maybe the Christian faith is a sacrifice of freedom, or maybe not necessarily just the Christian faith, but I think like faith in the good is a sacrifice of freedom, but it's because you're being enslaved to the good. So then I think that where me and Nietzsche would disagree is that he would say that sacrifice of freedom is bad, no matter what you're becoming enslaved to, and then I would say that it's possible that it could be good if you're enslaved to the good. He describes faith as self-mutilation. I thought that was really interesting too.
One line that stood out to me on page 16, you mentioned faith is good because it is the only way in which an individual can rise above the universal. What does that mean when you say above the universal? What are you referring to?
So once again, that was very much Kierkegaard's language of faith, and he kind of describes multiple paradoxes of faith, and one of the main ones he really talks about is the idea that for a very long time we thought that if something was universal, it was the highest. I mean, people describe God as being universal, and he is what we would say is the highest. But so there's the universal and then the individual. And Kierkegaard argues that through faith, and once again with Abraham, because he's trying to figure out how it's possible that what Abraham did could be considered good, he basically says that the individual can rise up to or even above the universal, which is paradoxical to say the least, because it doesn't really make sense that one individual could be above the entire universal. But that very much was me paraphrasing or quoting Kierkegaard, and so yeah, there's that idea. And that was, when I was reading Kierkegaard, I considered writing a whole paper just on that for a little while, just because that was so interesting to me.
Interesting.
What is Kierkegaard doing there? Why is he exploring that?
Kierkegaard is, he says at the beginning of his book that he has always been interested in the story of Abraham and Isaac, and he has always wondered how it is that Abraham could be praised by people. And there was an example, I can't remember if it was in the book or if Mr. Sparzo just brought it up when we were discussing it, but I remember there was an example of if someone today were to do that, were to go up, were to try to sacrifice their son somehow, I mean, we would all say they were a monster, right? Like, I don't think anyone here would say, oh, that's good that you did that. but Abraham is, I mean, he's praised as, he's the father of nations. He is one of the, he is seen as one of the best people morally in the Bible. So Kierkegaard's really trying to understand why that is, and one of the reasons that he gives is because it was ordained by God and Abraham did it through faith. He was actually rising above the ethical or above the universal and becoming somehow even better than the ethical, which, like I said, that's really confusing. I mean, he says it's paradoxical, so he realizes how confusing it is, but yeah.
So it's Kierkegaard's attempt to understand or to mesh what he views as a good God and an immoral action
Right, yeah.
through reason.
Yeah.
But
through reason to an extent, because he does say that, I mean, multiple times he says faith is paradoxical, which means that in a lot of ways faith does go against reason. So he kind of tries to use reason to make his argument that one can become above the universal, but then, I don't know, it's weird. He says that conclusion seems unreasonable. So he argues it with reason to an extent. Like,
okay.
yeah.
It is interesting. I wonder, it's like reason can get us so far, and
there's a leap of faith.
yeah,
That's
there's
what
a leap.
Kierkegaard
It's
says,
not
yeah.
that faith is. Well, let me ask you: is faith irrational, or is it that it's not totally provable? Like there is an element of mystery.
Well, I think that up until the point where it becomes unreasonable, I don't think it is faith. I think that's what I would call knowledge. And then I think that leap of faith that you have to make, that Kierkegaard describes, I think that is the faith itself. Like that's where the faith comes into play, and anything beyond that point I would say is faith. But up until that point, like the example I kind of brought up in my speech and in my paper of Aquinas' proof of God, I would say that kind of brings me logically to a point where I can say there is a higher power. But then for me to claim to know anything about the higher power would then be a leap of faith, and anything beyond that point would then be all based in faith